Chapter 5 is on the integumentary system, which is the skin. So we're going to begin by looking at the structures of the skin, and then later on in the chapter, we'll be talking about the functions of those parts of the skin. So on the left-hand side of this image, you can see the hair shaft, the part of the hair that is sticking out of the skin. The first layer, or the most superficial layer of the skin, is called the epidermis. And as you know by now, that is keratinized, stratified, squamous, epithelium. So it could be a question on the Unit 2 exam as well. So that's important to remember. Remember that it has that tough protein keratin in, which we'll be talking about soon. Deep to the epidermis is a layer called the dermis, and it's divided into two parts. The most superficial region of the dermis is called the papillary layer, and the deeper layer is the reticular layer. And the dermis is going to be connective tissue. And we'll be talking about the specific type of connective tissue that it is coming up. Deep to the dermis is the subcutaneous tissue or hypodermis, which is also connective tissue. You can see that it predominantly has fat cells, which are adipocytes, so it's adipose tissue. On the right-hand side of this diagram, we see these ridges called dermal papillae, and they're peg-like projections that are at the most superficial region of the papillary layer. And they're very important because they form the junction between the dermis and the epidermis. We then see other structures on the right-hand side, like the sweat pore. Some of the appendages of the skin that we'll talk about are some sweat glands. There's some different sweat glands. The most common one for thermoregulation is called the eccrine sweat gland, and it will have this coil structure. Below that is what we call the goosebump muscle. Technically, it's called the erector pili muscle, and when it contracts, the hair stands straight. Then we see the sebaceous oil gland, and the sebaceous oil glands are going to be associated with the hair itself. These are sebaceous glands as well. It's important for you to remember that this is not a sweat gland, it's an oil gland. Surrounding the base of the hair is what's called the hair follicle, and the very bottom of it is called the hair root. At the base of the dermis, we see a group of blood vessels, and that group of blood vessels is called the dermal vascular plexus. The word plexus means that it's a group of blood vessels or a group of nerves. One of the other functions of the skin is nervous system function. So it has these nervous structures, things like sensory nerve endings with free, or nerve fibers with free nerve endings, a lamellar corpuscle, which is also called the Pacinian corpuscle. And then last, we have the hair follicle receptor, which essentially is a group of nerves that are tangled around the hair follicle itself, so that when somebody pulls on your hair, it's going to be activated. And that information will be conveyed to the nervous system. This slide is showing the different types of cells that are present in the epidermis. We first have keratinocytes, and they're the majority of the epithelial cells. Their job, as you might very well guess, is to produce the tough, fibrous protein called keratin. And that keratin is very important for the defense that the skin provides us. The keratinocytes actually arise from the deepest layer of the epidermis, which specifically is called the stratum basal. There's going to be 4 or 5 layers of the epidermis, depending on where it's from. The second cell on this slide is the melanocytes, and the melanocytes are going to be responsible for the synthesis of the pigment melanin. And melanin also comes from the deepest layer of the epidermis, which would be the stratum basal. So that's very important to remember as well. And what the melanin rather does is it acts kind of like a shield to protect the nucleus, which is where the DNA is. It protects that nucleus from UV radiation. So it's kind of cool. It's almost like we have our built-in sunblock already. But this doesn't mean that you should not use sunscreens, because you definitely should. The other important thing about the melanocyte is that within the melanocytes, there are what are called melanosomes, and the melanosomes make the melanin. So this would be one of those various vesicles that are found within the cell. The next type of cell is called the dendritic cell. The dendritic cells are also called Langerhans cells, and we more commonly simply refer to them as dendritic cells, but you may see them as Langerhans cells. They kind of work like the immune system because there is no blood supply in the epidermis. Remember, one characteristic about epithelial tissue is that it is avascular, so there's no blood supply. And the blood supply would be where the white blood cells, the various other immune cells would come in. So in spite of that, to replace this, there are dendritic cells, which are going to ingest foreign substances. And when they ingest these foreign substances, they activate the immune system. And then finally, the last cell is called the tactile cell, and it's also called the Merkel cell. And it's going to be associated with nerve reception. So it's basically going to be attached to a sensory nerve ending. So essentially what it is it's a sensory receptor for touch. And then when we touch something, it transmits that information into the nervous system.